Hi, I'm Henry from 911virgin, the Porsche people in Uxbridge. Welcome to our latest video. It's been a while since our last video. We've had something of an unusual time with the COVID situation, so it's taken a while to get this video sorted. But we've reached 1,000 followers, which is really great. So thank you very much to everyone who's subscribed to the YouTube channel. And getting a few messages and having a bit of dialogue, which is nice, trying to respond to everything, getting some suggestions in. And I've said a couple of times on here that in terms of videos that we can make, it's largely dictated by what cars we get into the showroom or into the yard to sell. And that sort of dictates the cars. I think, okay, we'll make a video. So we've done the 3.2 Carrera, we've done the early 930 Turbo. This came in and it was too good an opportunity to miss. A very, very rare car. This is a 964 Celebration or Jubilee, launched in 1993 to celebrate 30 years of Porsche 911 production. I think I'm right in saying there was about 37, but somebody may correct me, UK right-hand drive. Most of them were in amethyst or viola, so a kind of purple colour, and there were, I believe, 6 in polar silver. To the absolute nerdy nerds, there were a couple of other cars in turbo-bodied form which weren't Celebration or Jubilee cars. So absolute numbers, but are a bit vague, but I think 911 in total of these produced. And as I think it was 37 UK right-hand drive cars, so quite rare. So let me talk a little bit about the 964 as a model. I think this is the first of the modern generation Porsche 911s. So the 3.2 Carrera, which preceded this, you can pretty much trace right back to 1963. And the car is essentially, I wouldn't say the same car, but largely the same car. There's a couple of things which made this fundamentally different to a 3.2 Carrera. Externally, it looks very similar to a 3.2 Carrera, or that model of car, or a 930, in terms of the fact that the panels are the same, except for the bumpers, of course. You've got the different front and rear bumpers. But I think the official figure was something like 87% of the car was different. And ironically, the only bits that aren't different are the bits you can see. Modern cars don't have a chassis. They use the body shell as a kind of monocoque construction. But if you see that the floor pan is the chassis of the car, the 3.2 Carrera has a flat floor pan. The 964 has a tunnel running down the middle of the floor pan. That does a couple of things. It makes it predominantly a stiffer car. It adds a lot of rigidity to the car, to the point where something like Lotus actually have a sort of chassis, which is that tunnel down the middle of the car and the wheels coming off it, and they kind of hang the rest of the car on it. So, you know, that part of the floor pan adds a lot of rigidity. And it also allows you to get power from the engine in the back to the wheels in the front, should you want to. The other big difference with the 964 is the way the suspension works. If you remember our 3.2 Carrera video, I talked about torsion bar suspension. So a rod that's fixed at one end, you have a trailing arm hanging off it on the rear, and it twists along its length. This car has multi-link coil suspension, so more traditional suspension, normal coils and then multi-links, which you can, it gives you more kind of scope to make changes to the suspension and so on. There's also a few other bits that bring it up to speed. You've got power steering, you've got ABS brakes, and one or two other bits and pieces we'll talk about later. But the sum total of this was that whereas I would say a 3.2 Carrera is an agricultural car to drive, and I got picked up on this by someone on the comments on the videos. He said, no, it's not agricultural, it's classic. And we are splitting hairs in terms of the choice of words, but a 3.2 Carrera is a real classic car drive, or as I might say, agricultural. Whereas this is a much more modern car. I always say with the 3.2 Carreras, you have to drive them as though you're riding a motorbike, look a long way ahead in terms of the braking and the way the car handles. With this, it's doing a lot more to help you. It feels a lot more friendly car in the way it's balanced, and obviously you put your foot on the brakes and it'll stop on the sixpence, and the ABS brakes does its magic to help you along. So a really modern, or the first of the modern cars, and I think everything from the 964 onwards I'd put in one class, and then the 3.2 Carrera backwards I'd put in another sort of era of Porsche production. So 964, when it came out, whenever Porsche launch a new car, the traditional Porsche fans tend to get a little bit angsty, and they generally don't like the new model. It's terrible. And when this came out, my goodness me, Porsche had made a terrible error. Of course, people saw the sort of colour-coded bumpers and so on, and in the late 80s, everything was going for kind of colour-coded body kits, and the initial assumption was that Porsche had just kind of kitted up a 911 and this was it, and perhaps hadn't realised all the differences and the changes that have been made to the car. And in the day, people thought, well, Porsche really should be looking backwards, back to the 2.4 S's, the 2.7 RS's and so on. But to me, I think the 964 is a beautiful car. I love the 964. And it's interesting when I talk to friends who sell Porsches and also who sell them and race them as well. We all have a real soft spot for the 964. It sits, I think, kind of flat on the road. And as I say, it's a lovely, lovely balanced car. So the engine on these is a 3.6 litre engine. Porsche increased the engine capacity from 3.2 to 3.6. And produced about 250 horsepower, so a little bit more power. And they also put some new electronics in there to help the combustion and the fuel efficiency in terms of kind of how it ran. If you come here, we'll have a little peek in the engine bay. This is a 964 engine. Incidentally, by the way, camera-wise, because we're on the COVID lockdown, we've got a different person. We've got Emily on the camera. So if the camera work is better this video than previous videos, let me know. I'll sack Matt and we'll keep Emily on full time. So just let me know. Anyway, back to the engine. So here we are at the engine. This car's got air conditioning, so you've got an air conditioning compressor in there. Air comes in there, you've got air filter in there, you've got airflow meter in there, a stabiliser valve there to stop it cutting out at tick over. Oil goes in there, oil filter in there, engine mounts just here. This is part of the cooling, alternator in here. This is part of the air cooling system. Now, a really nerdy, interesting fact. If you can follow my hand in here, Ems, you will notice here you've got two distributor caps. This engine has a twin plug cylinder head, so it's got two spark plugs in. And so you have a main distributor, and then you've got if you like, a slave distributor, which is driven off a little belt. And another thing that used to happen on these was the little belt that drives the two distributors, the slave one from the main one, used to snap. And so Porsche fitted these little tubes in here, and they're to take ionised air out of the distributor cap, and it stops the belt snapping. So the early cars, it was quite a common modification. So you should see all the cars now have these little pipes, and they take the ionised air away from the distributor, and they lessen the chance of having a belt snap in there. And if you have a belt go, it doesn't actually stop the car running because you've still got one distributor which is turning as it should do, the main engine-driven one, but the slave one stops turning, and it can mean you get it firing at the wrong time, which can cause some problems. But it's fairly easy to check. You simply disconnect one of the high-tension leads, and if you take one off and the engine stops, then you know there's a fault, that the other one's not being driven. Because it should make a tiny bit of difference, but it should still keep running. So there you go, that is a 964 engine. They did away with the fixed spoiler and they went for a motorised spoiler, and it's actually something that Porsche has then carried on to all the models beyond there. and this is it. So this spoiler pops up, and you've also got a manual button. If you want to either service it or clean it, you can lift it up from inside the car. I should know what speed it comes up, and I can't remember. I've got a funny feeling it might be set so it comes up at, when it was launched, something like 75 or 80 miles an hour. I think it might have been over the speed limit, and so it was a bit of a giveaway if your spoiler's up. I forget. I can't remember if it was this model or another one, but anyway, they probably reduced it then to 50 odd miles an hour just so that it wasn't a bad thing. But anyway, spoiler comes up and down. You've got a little, on this particular car, because it's the Celebration or Jubilee car, you have a little emblem on there to celebrate 30 years of production, and you also have one on the rear parcel shelf. And the rear parcel shelf one is quite cool, because if you look on the other side of it, it's written in reverse. So when you look at it from the mirror, you see it, the emblem for 30 year celebration of Porsche 911 ownership, and it reads correctly because you're looking at it in the mirror and it's in reverse on there. So they think of everything, these people, they're very clever. So the other thing that you get on this car are the cup mirrors, teardrop mirrors, and also cup alloys. For 1993 model year, I think teardrop mirrors and cup alloys were standard. And so they put them on the Jubilee or Celebration car. And of course, the other thing we haven't mentioned is the fact that the body grew a little bit as well. So the big feature of the Celebration or the Jubilee 30-year car was they brought back something which they had in the 3.2 Carrera era, which was a super sport. So basically a turbo-bodied car, but with a normally aspirated engine, so a non-turbo engine. And what Porsche did here is they took a Carrera 4, gave it a turbo body, but standard Carrera 4 brakes and suspension, so they didn't carry the brakes over. And I kind of run hot and cold with the turbo look cars, or turbo shaped cars. But the 965 turbo, this model, I just think's lovely. And maybe because I've got a soft spot for the 964, I just love the 964 as a model. As I say, I remember that transition from when it was a really kind of hard to drive agricultural 3.2 Carrera. You know, the 930s, I said in the video there, that was a really kind of tricky car to master to drive properly. But the 964 just suddenly started to help you out a bit, and was a much more modern car to drive. So these, I think, I personally think they're a really, really pretty car, and I like them. So this has actually got an airbag mod. So again, for 1993, they introduced an airbag on the steering wheel. So the steering wheel is slightly different for most of the 964s, but this later car has the airbag model. But again, when you sit in here, it's essentially 3.2 Carrera. So it's really strange that for a car with such massive differences, Porsche kept the interior the same, they kept the body the same, and changed all the bits you couldn't see. And in some ways, I think that sort of sums Porsche up a little bit, in that they produce a pretty car. They're not ugly cars. But I always think Porsches, you own them not to say to everyone, hey, look at me, look what I've got, but it's kind of from the inside out. It's the pleasure of driving it, and you know, you'll polish it and have a cup of tea and just look at it, and it's your inner pleasure. It's not to say, hey, look at me, everybody. And so Porsche almost weren't really showing off in terms of the technology changes they'd made, because this is still the same. We've still got the same 5-pod dash in here, albeit with a few more lights and so on that come on. The vents have grown in size a little bit, but you know, they're all in the same place. However, one thing that they did change was they changed the way the ventilation system was controlled massively. So anyone who's owned early 911s, we all have our special settings to get, you know, warm air on the screen and to get the cabin temperature just right. And I would take my settings to the grave with me. I would never share them with anybody. But all of a sudden, with a 964, you had a single touch screen demist button. You just hit that little button there, and the devil himself suddenly threw warm air onto the screen, and you could just get a blast of warm air to demist or defrost your screen, which was unheard of in the early cars. Yeah, there was some, you know, that's a massive technical change, but you kind of almost wouldn't know if you were just peering in here. You just think, oh yeah, it's the early 911. You've also got two little gauges just down here in front of the gear lever. So this one does the spoiler, so if you want to manually move it up or down for cleaning or servicing, and then this one engages four-wheel drive or takes off four-wheel drive. It engages the diff lock on the four-wheel drive, and then you've got a 5-speed gearbox there and so on. So, Achilles heels of the 964. When the car first came out, they actually launched it in a four-wheel drive version rather than the two-wheel drive version, and the two-wheel drive came out for the 1990 model year. The very, very early cars had a normal flywheel. The 1990 model year cars had a thing called a dual mass flywheel. First of all, why do you need a flywheel in a car? Flywheel is essentially a big lump of metal. And if you can imagine on a four-stroke engine, the engine only fires once every 2 rotations. So the cycles of the engine, the first half of the first turn, you've got induction when you're sucking in the fuel air mixture. Second half of the first revolution, you're compressing the fuel air mixture. First half of the second revolution, you've got power, which is when you ignite the fuel air mixture and you push it down. And then the final half of the second revolution is when the exhaust gases get forced out. So you've got to carry the momentum of the engine between the fires, or ignition, sorry. So you have the weight of the flywheel spinning round to help it go. You do, of course, have additional cylinders in an engine, but it helps smooth out the power delivery and keeps everything going. So one of the things that Porsche did, along with some other manufacturers, is said, okay, well, what we'll do, we'll split the flywheel into 2 halves. We'll have the engine side and the gearbox side, and we'll put a viscous coupling in between. And it allowed some twist between the 2 halves, and that took out some vibration. It smoothed things down a little bit. Unfortunately, when this was launched, the early dual mass flywheels were a little bit fragile and the viscous coupling failed, and so you would get the flywheels going from end stop to end stop and making a clunking noise. People went into their Porsche dealer, said, hi, I need to change my dual mass flywheel, or indeed when they changed their clutch, they said, yeah, you need a dual mass flywheel. And I said, okay. And the dual mass flywheel, I think, was about £1,200, so it's quite a big chunk of money, whereas a normal flywheel at the time was about £300-400. So people were a bit annoyed, and so it was seen as a weakness in the Achilles heel. The reality is, LUK got involved and they developed the dual mass flywheel to the point where now pretty much every single car has a dual mass flywheel in it. And dual mass flywheels, I think for these cars, the flywheel itself is, I'm going to say, £450. You can buy a dual mass flywheel for more ordinary cars for £150 upwards. So they're no longer the hideously expensive thing they used to be. And so the dual mass flywheel that you might hear about with the 964 is again, it's been replaced. It's not going to be an issue. The other thing that you may hear about with 964s is engine oil leaks. And there's essentially 2 areas where you'll find oil leaking from a 911 engine, either from the crankcase through bolt seals or from the barrel base gaskets. You have 2 halves of a crankcase. You've got the crankshaft in the middle and it's sandwiched in the middle. You've got bolts which hold the 2 halves of the crankcase together, and there's little silicon seals, because there's oil bathing in there, which stop the oil coming out. They used to go hard and they would allow some oil through. And the same with the rubber or silicon seal on the bottom of the barrels, where the barrels slide into the crankcase. They also would go hard and would allow oil to come out, and indeed still can. Again, the reality is that actually a 993 has the same seals, so they also can go hard and leak oil. But even with these, whilst people were having to rebuild engines because of or pull them apart and sort them out because of the oil leaks, whilst a 3.2 Carrera may not leak oil in the same way, they actually still needed the same engine overhaul, because when you were doing the gaskets in the engine, you'd do piston rings, timing chains, valve guides. So you'd do an engine freshener, bearings if it needed it. And the 3.2 Carrera, when it was of sort of similar age to this and had been used, would also require an engine rebuild, but owners may not realise it because it wasn't leaking oil as a 964 did. So really, all it did was, I think, make owners realise their engine needed pulling apart and looking at and giving a fresh up. And you know, we've seen plenty of 3.2 Carreras that we've pulled apart where you've got piston rings that are literally hair thin and valve guides that need changing and so on. So on other models you will also do engine work. So it's not unique to this, but they got a bit of a reputation. So here we are out in the road in the 964, and compared to the earlier cars we've been out in, it's a much more modern car to drive. You know, these were quite a revolution, or revelation should I say, when they came out, and you really did feel as though you'd, you know, jumped ahead quite a few years. I think if you'd cut your teeth on the early cars where you were driving them as you'd ride a motorbike, when you got in one of these, it was a pretty easy car to drive. It's still, you know, engines in the back, and it's a Porsche 911, it's powerful, so you've got to be careful, but in relative terms you really did feel it was trying to help you out. Because this is a Carrera 4, it potentially feels a slightly heavier drive than a Carrera 2, and I say potentially because I think at this age, when these cars are, what are they, 25-30 years old, I think there's more difference between two individual cars than there is necessarily between, let's say, a 2 and a 4. If you've got a 4 with a really, really light clutch, a 2 with a really, really heavy clutch, then the 2 will feel a heavier car to drive. But I think a combination of this being a 4 and the turbo body, I think it does feel a slightly sort of heavier, I don't know, almost more grown-up car to drive. It's almost like you're kind of borrowing your dad's car and taking that out for a drive a little bit. But it's just a much more modern platform compared to the earlier 930s and 3.2 Carreras. And as an environment, as I mentioned earlier, suddenly you've got things like ventilation. It sounds really silly to be making a big thing about ventilation. You know, who cares about ventilation? Surely you put wind on the windscreen and temperature in the car and so on. But because the early cars were such a black art to get everything adjusted to try and get air where you wanted it to, with this 964, with the control panel here for the ventilation, it's just so modern. This particular car's got air conditioning and it actually works. You know, it produces nice cool air. You can direct it where you want it to go, and as I say, if you want to, you can just, you know, whack a single button down and get a single touch screen demisting with it, which is quite amazing. So you still get a bit of engine noise and so on. You know, this is still very much an analog car when you're driving it. I mean, it's still created in that Porsche, even at this age, could kind of make the car sound and feel and handle however they wanted it to. But, you know, it's proper exhaust noise. You don't feel as though it's sort of manufactured exhaust noise. It's what a 3.6 litre flat six air-cooled engine sounds like when you put your foot down, which is nice. Gear changing, it's quite solid, kind of quite heavy gear changing. The throw is shorter than the 3.2 Carrera, so it takes less movement to get it into gear, and it's really positive in terms of, you know, where it's going into gear. But still, it's a slightly sort of slow gear change, in that with all 911s you need to almost show it the gear and then just force it through. You don't bang it really hard because it doesn't like that. But it's a great gearbox. Unlike the roads in South Buckinghamshire where we've just gone over the Grand Canyon. You've still got the kind of slightly crazy switchgear layout in the 964. They've sort of modernised it a little bit in terms of the the actual switches, and as I say, the vents got a little bit bigger. But for instance, you've still got the mirror adjustment is here on the right hand side, but then to select from left to right mirror, you have to reach underneath on the left hand side and select which mirror you want. The sunroof, again, you're kind of reaching underneath trying to find a button that you can't really see, and then that does the sunroof. So it's still crazy. And as I say, I find it really weird that I think, as I said earlier, the percentage, like 87% of the car was different, and yet kind of 92.7% of what you can actually see and touch is still the same as a 3.2 Carrera. So, you know, it really was the engineers were dominating and were making the changes and pushing the technology, but I don't know, the kind of interior designers and so on, they almost ignored them. You know, it was all about the kind of metal and mechanical parts, and still you had this kind of crazy switchgear layout and so on. And as I say, the instrument cluster is straight out of a 3.2 Carrera. Well, there you go. I mean, that's a really pleasant afternoon. I enjoyed that, and you know, I'm glad we've covered the 964 a bit, because I think this is quite a sort of seminal car in Porsche's lineup. In that, for me, it's the first of the new generation Porsches. I think everything prior to the 964 is classic 911, and whilst these are a classic car, I see this as a kind of older modern car. And yeah, I really enjoyed driving this, and we may do some more videos with the 964 in specific models within the 964 lineup, but we'll see how we go. But I'm glad we got this, and this is a bit of an opportunity. It's a very rare car, so I think there's 37 of these in the UK, and I think 3 in Polar Silver. So yeah, quite a rare beast. But anyway, I hope you've enjoyed the video. Many thanks to everyone who's subscribing. As I say, we were really thrilled when we hit 1,000 subscribers, which is really good, so thank you for that. And if you've got any thoughts, feel free to post your comments, and we try to respond as soon as you post them. And yeah, in the meantime, I'm Henry, we're 911 Virgin, and yeah, stay safe. Goodbye, cheers.